I do have copies, hard copies of my duty to report complaint that I filed with jurisdiction in Minnesota. I don't have enough for each of you. I have about 25 copies, so I would like to just set them up here. And those of you, or maybe we could pass them around, but if you're interested in it, you can grab a copy, and that will give you a background of what we're going to be talking about this afternoon.
Give them to the lawyers.
Specifically, what we're going to be talking about is the title of my report is Duty to Report Maltreatment of Children. And the duty to report maltreatment of children is a statute that has been adopted by at least the state of Minnesota, the state of North Dakota, and I believe each one of the 50 states of the nation have adopted the duty to report. And what the duty to report requires is healthcare professionals, all of the nurses, doctors, administrators who are in the healing arts business, that if they see, observe, or know of physical abuse, sexual abuse, or neglect ongoing, they must report that to the authorities. So that's essentially what we are going to be talking about this afternoon. Maybe I can. Okay, there. Okay, so I have to see how this is going to work now. Okay, so my subtitle is "Taking the Fight for Genital Autonomy to the Street." And what I have noticed over the years in the course of my practice is that I represent one individual who is an infant. The parents are there. Their whole decision is based on a discrete set of facts. Who they are, where they are, what doctor did the cutting, and whether or not they made an impact. Many times these settlements, or these cases end in settlement, with a confidential settlement, so it cannot be disclosed. So it really is of very limited purpose to change the minds and hearts of the people that we're trying to reach. So just briefly, my journey to enlightenment in this area owes a debt of gratitude to Jody McLaughlin and Dwayne Voskuil, who came to me back in 1996 after successfully lobbying the legislature of the state of North Dakota to pass an FGM prohibition. They tried to get a gender-neutral bill passed in the North Dakota legislature, were unsuccessful doing that. They then shopped around for an attorney who would be willing to challenge that statute on an equal protection basis, which led them to the next state of Minnesota and into my office some fateful day in 1996. And after that, I was not certain I wanted to get involved in that issue. I already had my children, they were born, they were uncircumcised. Why did I need this additional issue? But once they started talking to me about their position, I began reflecting on it. I talked to my family members, and I come from a rather large family. I have 14 siblings, and they all told me, stay out of it, don't do it. It's not going to do any benefit to you. But after giving some reflection and understanding the constitutional rights that were impaired by this procedure, I consented, and the constitutional rights won out. I have recently formed an entity, and it's easy to form an entity. It's a nonprofit entity called Public Prosecutors Initiative, LLC, and the purpose is to protect and defend individual liberties and constitutional rights, irrespective of gender, of all humans, including newborn infants. I am at this time the sole member of Public Prosecutors Initiative, and as a member of Public Prosecutors Initiative, I prepared a complaint on the duty to report. That complaint is filed not only on behalf of Public Prosecutors Initiative, and you have that complaint in front of you right now that you can look at at your leisure. It is a lengthy document. It's 146 paragraphs, and it cites a lot of the history of circumcision and tries to move the needle in that respect. So I look at this as a new strategy, shifting from the individual, who is that individual injured person, to one representing all of the kids that are being cut.
Oh, yes.
Without having that attorney-client relationship. So who are the victims in this whole proceeding? The victims are the children. And the complaint comes from Public Prosecutors Initiative and Zenas Baer as a public citizen, not as a lawyer. And this duty to report, and I believe this to be true in almost all of the versions in all of the states, is that if you have knowledge of physical abuse, neglect, or sexual abuse as defined in the duty to report, you have an obligation to report that maltreatment. The abuse in our case, in our contention, is caused by MDs, nurses, and administrators participating in the ritual cutting circumcision of males. The abuse is done with complicity of the parents who, because of circumstances and conditions beyond their controls, that is, the customs, the rituals, religious practices, lack the ability to keep their children safe from physical abuse, neglect, or sexual abuse. That's actual language directly from the statute of the duty to report. So there are, the legislature recognized that most of the times people want to keep their children safe, but there are certain times where, because of circumstances beyond their control, customs, rituals, cultural or religious practices, they cannot make that decision to keep their children safe. So we contend that that is a basis to come and do the report. Now, as a lawyer, and I'm sure all the other lawyers here have a similar rule that requires their attention to the law. The law and the lawyer professional responsibility rules say that as a public citizen, a lawyer has a special responsibility for the quality of justice. That we as lawyers, even irrespective of the attorney-client relationship, have a duty to ensure that there's quality legal services rendered to the population out here as a whole. And it says, as a member of the learned profession, we should cultivate knowledge of the law that, beyond its use for clients, employ that knowledge in reform of the law and work to strengthen legal education. So that's part of what I am doing today, is carrying out my duty and obligation as a lawyer to teach a little bit about what the law is. The public citizen as a lawyer, we further have to ensure that there's an understanding of the rule of law and justice, because legal institutions and a constitutional democracy depend on popular participation to support and maintain their authority. And that was addressed in some of the other comments made during the course of this seminar so far. The one I want to point on is that, therefore, all lawyers should devote professional time and resources and use civic influence to ensure equal access to our system of justice for all those who, because of economic or social barriers, cannot afford or secure adequate legal counsel. It is for that purpose that I am here to defend the rights of individual infants to be intact in their body and their souls. So the duty to report the complaint is essentially saying that the non-consensual cutting, that is the circumcising of infant males, is by statutory definition physical abuse, neglect, and sexual abuse. The statute is clear that if you cut an individual human, That is a representation of physical abuse. Cutting is never allowed. Genital cutting does violence to the basic fundamental liberty of bodily integrity. Mandatory reporters include all employed in the healing arts. So if any of you are doctors or nurses who have knowledge that this abuse is taking place, it is your obligation, in my read of the statute, to report that to the appropriate authorities. Mandatory reporters' failure to report is a crime, and that's where this whole initiative is focused, is on the public prosecutors to enforce this statute, that is, the duty to report. The duty to report statute is unique in as much as it forces us to look at the procedures from the child's perspective. In other words, let's play this little thought experiment for a moment. Aliens descend on our society. They come from a society that cuts all men. We have grown adult men here that are not cut. The aliens, they can't understand American, they can't understand any humanoid language. They've placed these humans, adults, grown humans, onto a circumstrate and cut their genitals without any diagnosis or therapeutic purpose. Substitute the MD for the alien and the child for the human, and what do you have? You have the non-consensual cutting by these alien invaders, which would be assault in the first degree, criminal sexual conduct in the first degree, false imprisonment, kidnapping, and a host of other crimes, let alone demonstrate the depravity of the human condition. Such treatment of another human is criminal, barbaric, and inhumane. So why does the infancy of the victim protect the perpetrators? And I notice that some people are concerned about language being used in this debate. Perpetrators is a term that is not made up by me, but that is straight out of the criminal sexual conduct statute that says perpetrators, that's how they refer to those who do criminal sexual conduct, as perpetrators. In other words, they're perps. And those people who are conducting these circumcisions are no better than perps.
Hear, hear! Hear, hear! Hear, hear!
The age of the victim does not in any way diminish the seriousness of the felonious offenses against that individual. The intentional assault of a helpless infant may demonstrate even a depraved mind. Let's refresh the procedure that is used. You have an involuntary restraint with 4 Velcro straps to conveniently hold the humanoid without resistance. You have the exposure of a normal penis. You have the cutting, and then you have the denuded penis as an end result. The newborn infant, remember, is a human being. The diagnosis on birth is normal, healthy, term male. And a normal, healthy, term male born on American soil is an American citizen, cloaked with all of the rights and privileges that you and I enjoy. It's that citizen that we are here to protect. And the constitutional rights that are impaired include the life, liberty, and property without due process of law. That's the 14th Amendment. The non-consensual removal of normal erogenous tissue deprives the owner of the choice, deprives the owner of the use of the severed foreskin, causes a permanent scar, promotes keratinization of the glands, and permanently deprives the owner of the benefits. Now, under Minnesota law, which I am most familiar with and which I have done more research in developing this duty to report complaint, the Supreme Court has already ruled that the Minnesota courts have an independent responsibility for safeguarding the rights of its citizens. And we contend that its citizens include one-day-old infants that are diagnosed as normal, healthy, full-term infants. Under Minnesota law, I choose the right of privacy as an illustrative point, that there's a Jarvis versus Levine in 1988. This was a case involving neuroleptic medications, and the court ruled and stated, quote, "The right of privacy begins with protecting the integrity of one's own body and includes the right not to have it altered or invaded without consent. When intrusive treatment is proposed, the professional judgment of medical personnel insufficiently protects this basic human right." Now this is dealing with adult humans where the Department of Human Services was going to administer neuroleptic medication. The patient did not want it, did not appear to need it. He resisted. It went to the court, and the court made this ruling on the right of privacy. Similarly, Minnesota Board of Health versus City of Brainerd is a fluoridation case where the city was fighting the federal government requirement to fluoridate water. And so they said, the Supreme Court again in this case said, no right is held more sacred or is more carefully guarded by the common law than the right of every individual to the possession and control of his own person, free from all restraint or interference of others, unless by clear and unquestionable authority of law. What this tells us is that personal autonomy is a basic human right. Cutting of a child is never considered reasonable punishment. The statute even says that reasonable punishment is allowed under the statute, but it specifically says that no cutting is permissible. We contend that surgical removal of the foreskin without medical diagnosis or therapeutic purpose violates the rights to individual autonomy. Now, mandatory reporters are those who are engaged in the healing arts, social workers, law enforcement, psychiatric entities, anyone who comes into contact with other humans that can observe the condition of the human being in front of them. And it says anybody who has reason to believe that a child is being physically abused, neglected, or sexually abused, quote, shall immediately report the information to the local welfare agency, Department of Health and Human Services. It covers all healthcare providers. And if we consider that newborns' first sexual experience is the forced, non-consensual, traumatic cutting, crushing, clamping, and surgical removal of the most erogenous tissue of the human body, which causes deep trauma. And I've always wondered if brain development is enhanced by playing Bach to the child in utero. The negative impact of cutting a penis of a newborn infant, the detrimental effects on the brain matter cannot be in dispute. They just cannot be in dispute. So circumcision did not start, of course, with the medical profession. It was through religion. And many people that I talk to still fall back and say, well, it's required by the Bible. Not so fast. In the Old Testament, of course, all of you are probably familiar with this, that Abraham and Yahweh have this covenant as a token of covenant betwixt me and you. And if you are not circumcised, this gets to your point, Mark, this morning, I think, it says, that soul shall be cut off from his people. He hath broken my covenant. This is an important, I think, message from the biblical standpoint and the Jewish standpoint particularly, that If you are not circumcised, the Bible says you will be cut off from the people. And I think that is probably something that is a motivating factor for many of the Jewish folks. And Apostle Paul, of course, and I saw a t-shirt around here citing Galatians 5:2, and I was pleased to see that because it came into my the presentation as well. If you go on, Paul renounces those of the circumcision in Titus. He says, whose holds there are many unruly and vain talkers and deceivers, specifically they of the circumcision, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole houses, teaching things they ought not, for filthy lucre's sake. The filthy lucre's sake is what I tag onto the medicalization of circumcision right now. That is a filthy lucre sake to be capitalizing on circumcising young boys where they're getting paid by insurance companies to do that abuse. But genital cutting did not come to America on the biblical teachings. It's much more dubious. John Harvey Kellogg, I'm sure all of you are aware, he had this belief that bodily fluids judged whether or not the body was going to be healthy. Masturbation released bodily fluids and therefore decreased the ability to fight diseases. He famously wrote that the cutting should be performed by a surgeon without administering anesthetic, as the pain attending the operation will have a salutary effect upon the mind, especially if it is connected with the idea of punishment. Now again, this report is directed to the caregivers who are supposed to be taking care of an infant child, not abusing that infant child. So I looked to the AAP task force on circumcision, and one of the prominent teachings of the AAP task force is that it says physicians who counsel families about the decision should ensure that parents understand that circumcision is an elective procedure. And they go on to say that in a pluralistic society, why shouldn't parents take into consideration cultural, religious, or ethnic traditions in addition to what the AAP says is the benefit to make that decision? But I look back on to the Minnesota Supreme Court decision on the right of privacy, and they hold, when intrusive treatment is proposed, the professional judgment of medical personnel insufficiently protects bodily integrity, a basic human right. So I'm hoping that that can be a statement that can carry the day. Gender discrimination, we need not spend a lot of time on that. Genital tissue is genital tissue. It does us no good, in my mind, to parse out differences between FGM and MGM. It's genital tissue. It comes from the same genetic stock. We just saw slides this morning that up until 8 weeks, it's indifferentiated. It is the same tissue that is being cut. So I would argue, and I've come to the conclusion, that there is no meaningful distinction between FGM and MGM. It is genital tissue that is cut without consent of the owner and should be prohibited. Child neglect is, by definition, failure to protect the child from conditions or actions that seriously endanger the child's physical and mental health. And our position is that to knowingly place a child with an MD, a nurse, or administrators who are going to be cutting off his penis is, by definition, child neglect. Instead of protecting the child, the doctors, nurses, and administrators are profiting from the non-consensual cutting of the minor infants. Physical abuse is any injury inflicted by a person responsible for the child's care, that is, the MDs, nurses, and administration and parents, on a child other than by accidental means or any physical or mental injury that cannot reasonably be explained by the child's history of injuries. Now, the important language here is, what injury did that child suffer to present with a scar that goes all the way around his penis? There was no injury, and that condition cannot be explained by the child's history of injuries, and therefore it is not an accident, it is physical abuse. Sexual abuse is any forced penetration of the sexual opening of a person under the age of 13. Any intrusion, however slight, into the genital or anal opening is a felony under Minnesota law. MDs often rely on the medical purpose exclusion to escape liability, but the medical purpose only applies to penetration for a, quote, bona fide medical purpose. And it is our contention that the elective circumcision is not for a bona fide medical purpose, and therefore does not enjoy the protection of the medical purpose exclusion. What are the obligations of a licensing agency upon receipt of a report? They are duty-bound to investigate and make findings on the need for protection of children. If allegations of criminal conduct are contained in the complaint, they must refer that to law enforcement to investigate from a legal law enforcement standpoint. Local welfare agency must make two determinations. The first is, did maltreatment occur? The second is, are protective services necessary? And the person who is submitting the complaint has a right to have a copy of the report that was prepared. The notice is served that in Minnesota, the latest figures I had from the Department of Health were that 59% of the boys were circumcised. In our contention, 59% of the boys leave the hospital as victims of assault in the first degree, criminal sexual conduct in the first degree, physical abuse, child abuse, substantial child endangerment. All of this at the hands of the MDs, nurses, and parents who are supposed to be there to help and protect these children. We contend that mandatory reporting is required. How will we measure success? Measuring success will be the public exposure of the hypocrisy, shaming authorities into compliance, public agency required to make a report, the report viewed from the child's perspective. And I think that is the most important part of this complaint, is if we could ever find an analysis like the Cologne court did of the rights of the child and look at this from the child's perspective. The multiplying effect of filing a duty to report complaint is that it has, in Minnesota alone, we have 87 counties. The county attorney in each one, there's one county attorney in each one, there's a social service director in each one. Each one of those, if a report is filed, must go through this process. So the chance, if we only get one person who's willing to pursue a duty to report violation, that could change the landscape. All 50 states have a duty to report, and I hope that this can be of some success. Now, the complaint that I just distributed to you, I did serve that on the local officials on April 25th, so it has not been yet 10 days, but I hope when I get back that I'll have a response to it. But I would encourage you that I think this is a way to try to strategize to get more public focus on this issue. Thank you very much.
I'm gonna report my sister.
That's good, do it.
The screen of this place to mark the proper location.
Circumcision denies a male's right to genital integrity and to a fully functioning penis.
Near the screen of this place to mark the proper location.
Then we clap it.